We want to welcome you to today's forum. We're delighted to have you join us for what promises to be a very interesting discussion on the nation's debt, the nation's dilemma, and the New Hampshire impacts. This morning's breakfast is a collaborative event by the New Hampshire Forum on the Future, co-sponsored this morning by Fix the Debt, the Concord Coalition, the New Hampshire Institute of Politics here at St. Anselm College, and the Warren B. Rudman Center for Justice, Leadership, and Public Policy. We want to thank everyone at each of these organizations for their assistance and cooperation in making this event possible. Before we begin, let me take a moment to recognize a few folks who are here this morning. Representing United States Senator Kelly Ayotte, we have Bud Fitch and Chris Conway. Former Congressman and Ambassador Dick Swett is with us in the front. From the New Hampshire Legislature, we have State Senator Peggy Gilmore. State Senator Sharon Carson. And fresh from the radio show this morning, Senator Lou D'Alessandro. We want to thank our premier sponsors who help us with these events: AARP, Fidelity Investments, Granite State Employment Project, the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation, and the Nellie Mae Educational Foundation. And also our charter sponsors, the New Hampshire Higher Education Assistance Foundation, the New Hampshire Center for Public Policy, Campus Compact for New Hampshire, the Institute of Politics at St. Anselm College, New England College, Stay Work Play New Hampshire, the University System of New Hampshire, the New Hampshire College and University Council, the New Hampshire High Technology Council. And this morning we are recognizing two new sponsors. We have People's United Bank and Sheehan Finney Bass and Green. And Mary White from People's Bank and Brad Cook, our good friend from Sheehan Finney, is here with us. Thank you. Our sponsors provide critical financial support for the Forum on the Future and make these events possible. If you're interested in joining the long list of sponsors, there's some information on your table, and we'd love to talk to you about that. At this time, I'd like to introduce one of the founding supporters of the Forum on the Future, starting back in 2005, the president of the NHIOP Network Organization, Mr. Renee Druin, for a special acknowledgement. Renee.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Joe, for letting us crash this party. We appreciate it. But we appreciate the opportunity to take just a few minutes to talk with you about a scholarship program that the NHIOP Network launched over 10 years ago. And it's been very successful. We've had some successful New Hampshire companies that are, including several CEOs that are part of it, and they're in this room this morning. You'll know them as the CEO logo and the name on their badge that you can see, and we thank you for, and sincerely for your support. This morning we'll be fortunate to hear from former Senator and good friend Judd Gregg, who was chairman of the Education Committee, and I can't thank you enough, Senator Gregg, for all the years of work that you did for higher education. Much appreciated. We'll hear from Senator Gregg in regards to the national debt. And for many Americans, they look to the college tuition bill across the kitchen table and see the rising cost of college and how their own student loan debt is impacting their life's functions. In total, the College Equals Opportunity, which is our CEO program that we founded, has raised almost $300,000 in the last 10 years since its inception in 2004. Among this year's class, we have a former Bosnian refugee with aspirations of becoming a physician's assistant, inspired by the physician who helped her father walk again. A service-oriented student originally from Dominican Republic who aspires to pay it forward to the country who gave him so much through a career in law enforcement. An inspiring for American student with a passion for working with refugees who balances their service commitments, internships, and part-time jobs. An adult student who has committed hundreds of hours of service to improve mental health services in the greater Nashua area. A farmer, former NHPR intern and coffee shop employee who serves on the debate team for fun, but serves the YWCA as a crisis interventionist. Please join me in congratulating the 2014 class of award recipients whose dedication to their studies and the communities is exceptional. Stephanie Roy of Nashua Community College and Riviera University. Marcos Diaz of National Community College and Southern New Hampshire University, Catherine Wynot of Keene State College, Bridget Syka of St. Anselm's College, Almadina Kashan of Manchester Community College and UNH Manchester, Alicia Frazier of Southern New Hampshire University, Brandon Pierre of Plymouth State College, Catherine Muzzy of St. Anselm's College. Please congratulate them on the honor. Some conversation with them. They're a great group of people, and we congratulate you on behalf of the NHIOP Network organizations. Thank you, Tom.
Thanks, Renee. The NHIOP Network has done a lot of important work for students and student loans and helping them repay debt. Congratulations to NHIOP for this good work. Now to introduce our first speaker, I am most honored to introduce the former New Hampshire Supreme Court Justice, John Gregg. As you likely know, John has recently announced that he'll be stepping down as Dean of the UNH School of Law, where he has led a very successful transformation of this important institution. And it's also been announced that he'll become Executive Director of the Warren B. Rudman Center for Justice, Leadership, and Public Policy, something for which he has a passionate commitment to succeed. Please join me in welcoming Dean Broderick.
Good morning. It should be apparent to everyone in the room that I have trouble holding a job. I should have a new job in 3 or 4 years. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. And just very briefly, I want to thank Fred Coker for allowing the Rudman Center to be part of this program this morning. Rudman Center was started 2 years ago with Senator Rudman's direct involvement, and it has 2 purposes. One is to provide a neutral stage, a national stage, hopefully, for the discussion of national policy issues. Senator Gregg has come on one occasion and spoken. We appreciate it. And also, and just as near and dear to me, to allow a select number of young people at law school to get a free ride in exchange for 3 years of public service upon graduation. And this year, this August, the first 2 Rudman Fellows will be coming. So we're excited about his future. I encourage you to kind of watch the web. I'd love to have you come. This October, we have 3 former presidential chiefs of staff coming. I'd love you to participate. It's free. So the price is right. My assignment this morning is to introduce Governor Rendell, who all of you know, I'm sure. I had occasion to spend a few minutes with him beforehand this morning, and I didn't see why he was so popular in Pennsylvania. The mayor was born in New York City, graduated from the University of Pennsylvania, and went to Villanova Law School, where he had a law degree. He decided to run for district attorney in Philadelphia in 1977, and he was elected to that job. That's a tough job in a major city in America. And then he went on to hold 2 of the toughest jobs in the United States. He was the mayor of a large city, Philadelphia, and the governor of a large state. And everyone knows your name and your zip code, and you're accessible. And that's a tough, tough job. But apropos this morning, when Governor Rendell became mayor of Philadelphia, after his election in 1991, the city was facing a deficit, this is $1991, of $250 million. And he turned it around. He turned it around. And as mayor of Philadelphia, they had 5 years of surplus. And the New York Times described him as having engineered, and I'm quoting, the most stunning turnaround in recent urban history. He was elected governor of Pennsylvania on 2 occasions. Their term limited. Well, he'd probably still be governor of Pennsylvania. What was most impressive to me in reading his bio is that when he was elected a second time, with 60% of the vote, he defeated Lynn Swann, who was a Hall of Fame wide receiver. And if you can defeat Lynn Swann in Pennsylvania, you've got to be pretty good. The governor was also on several shortlists in 2004 and 2008 for the vice presidency, and talked by some as a potential presidential candidate. In 2000, by the way, he stepped down early on his job as mayor, and he assumed the role as chairman of the Democratic National Committee, which makes him one of the living authorities on the definition of a hanging chad. I think they finished counting those votes in Florida. In any event, it's a real honor. I feel like I've known the governor for a long time. I just met him today. That's the kind of person he is. And so it's an honor to have him here, and I look forward to his remarks. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, John. That was very good. I have to tell you, though, that when I ran against Lynn Swan, it was even worse than that. It was 2006, and if you recall, the Steelers were in the Super Bowl, and I, as governor, went to support the Steelers. We went out to Detroit. They were playing the Seahawks, and lo and behold, with 40,000 Pittsburghers in the stands, all voters, they had the Super Bowl MVPs come out one by one. And Lynn Swan was a Super Bowl MVP. When he came out, the 40,000 Pittsburghers just roared with enthusiasm. And I thought I was in big trouble. Lynn Swan is a very charismatic, very well-spoken, very intelligent African-American. And he had been in sports broadcasting, but had all of the requisites to be a successful candidate. And a friend of mine from Philadelphia was out in Pittsburgh doing business in April, right after the campaign started, and it started with a lot of enthusiasm for Lynn Swan. And my friend was worried that I had gotten, as a Democrat, and as a Democrat who had done a good job in Philadelphia, I had gotten a very high percentage of the African-American vote, both in Philadelphia and in Pittsburgh. And he got into a taxi cab, and the driver was African-American, so he started questioning him about the governor's race. And he said, "I suppose you're going to vote for Lynn Swan?" The taxi driver shook his head no. And he said, "Why not?" He said, "Too pretty. I'm voting for the ugly guy." And as Judd knows in politics, whatever it takes. Well, let me say it's a pleasure to be here. And John was kind enough to say that I was considered as a potential presidential candidate. I actually burned my bridges when I was invited by the New Hampshire Democrats to address their spring convention in 2007, I think. And I had an interview before I addressed the convention, and I said one of the things the party needs is that, and I think the country needs, and I'm here to tell you this, and you're not going to like what I'm going to say, we have to change the way we select our nominees. Iowa and New Hampshire should not decide who the President of the United States is. And had Hillary Clinton lost in New Hampshire, Barack Obama was nominated. Before it got to any big state, any state with any significant industrial base, any state with significant diversity, was wrong. And the Secretary of State, when I was DNC chair, had proposed 5 10-state regional primaries a month apart, rotating every 4 years. So when I gave that interview, I knew that I was signing away my chances of being president of the United States. And I actually signed away my chances of being vice president on a number of occasions as well. But it's a pleasure to be here. And let me say that I got involved in Fix the Debt when the Fix the Debt folks called me, and they told me that Judd Gregg would be the co-chair. And I've always admired Senator Gregg. When I was governor, when I was mayor, I think he's one of the clearest thinking people we've ever had in politics, and a person of incredible integrity. And I didn't really have to know much about Fix the Debt. I knew we needed to fix the debt, but as long as Judd was going to be the co-chair, I thought it was something that I definitely wanted to be involved in, and it's been an honor to work with Judd. We go to these forums, and sometimes people are bitterly disappointed because they're expecting sort of fireworks. And on this issue, not on every issue, but on this issue, we agree, I'd say, on 90–95% of what needs to be done. And let me pivot off that and start in saying we have a serious debt problem, and notwithstanding what you read, we have a serious deficit problem. If you read what's been in the papers lately, if you listen to both President Obama and his folks and the Congress, you'd think the deficit was resolved. Well, the deficit has gone down, but it went down from incredibly high levels, and it's going up again. Even with the sequester in place, the deficit will start to go up in 2016, and by 2022, we'll be running yearly deficits of over $1 trillion again, even with sequestration in place. But the deficit is only a part of the problem. The debt is the longer-term problem. And we've we've achieved $4.1 trillion over a 10-year period in deficit and debt reduction, 4.1 trillion. We need to do at least another 2.2 trillion to make sure that at the end of the 10-year period, by 2024, debt is 70% of GDP. Now, 70% of GDP is acceptable. That means you're not on a path to becoming Greece. It's acceptable. But historically, debt in this country has been about 39% of GDP. And as early as 2007, debt was 35% of GDP. And now we're fighting desperately to get it back to 70% of GDP. So we haven't resolved our problem in any way, shape, or form. And the debt reduction that we've done and the deficit reduction that we've done so far, it's been done piecemeal. It hasn't been done comprehensively. It hasn't been done with any eye to the future. It hasn't been done for the out years. It's been done to sort of kick the can down the road and calm the problem for the next few years. It hasn't been done with any comprehensive long-term vision. And as a result, as you go out in the out years, years 10 to 20 and 20 to 30, it becomes flat out disastrous, the path that we're on. Flat out disastrous, and we need to do something about it. There's no question about that. And, Judd will talk about that. I want to mention just one or two broad concepts, and Judd will talk about that, and we'll answer some questions on how do we achieve them. But let me also, as we drove in, there were two protesters, and I was very disappointed in New Hampshire that they could only list two protesters. And they were protesting that to fix the debt, folks, myself and Judd included, think we have to do something about Social Security. So the question always arises, and if you read my email and the responses I get on Twitter, I get savaged by people who call themselves progressives and call themselves liberals all of the time for talking about this subject, for talking about the need for entitlement reform. So the question arises, why should a progressive, and I am a proud progressive, why should a proud progressive care about debt, care about, well, didn't Dick Cheney tell us the deficit didn't matter? I think that was a direct quote from Dick Cheney, but why would a progressive care about this? And why would a progressive care about it enough to endanger hallowed and sacred social programs? Well, let me tell you why a progressive should care about this. One was if we keep delaying, putting off doing something about this, there will be a day when we reach Armageddon. There will be a day of reckoning, and the cuts then will be so drastic and so painful, they will make us sorry that we didn't do something in the long term that could be smoothed out over 2 or 3 decades. It will be horrible if we continue to stop doing this. The second reason a progressive should care about it is the solvency of the two programs. What difference does it matter what the benefit level is if the programs cease to exist, or if the programs are forced to radically cut benefits? Consider this, and this all comes from the CBO. We don't make these statistics up and fix the debt, Judd and I don't make them up. These are all statistics from them. Let me read you some shocking things. In Social Security by 2033, 20 years from now, by 2033, Social Security's trust fund will be exhausted. And that will mean the only way they can survive is to cut benefits by 23%. There's also a fund in Social Security called the Social Security Disability Fund. You know that people who aren't seniors but have disabilities can get payments from SSI, from Social Security. The Disability Trust Fund will be exhausted in 2 years. And unless we do something to replenish it, it will mean a 23% cut in benefits that 12-year-old children who desperately need wheelchairs because they've got multiple sclerosis and definitely need aid, their parents need aid, they'll lose their 20% of their 23% of their benefits. So the very fact that Social Security is threatened, Medicare, thanks to President Obama, we got it in 10 years of life, but in 2026, Medicare basically runs out of money, and there'll have to be a significant fix, which will involve probably a more drastic cut in benefits if we don't do it and do it now. So the second reason progressives should care about this issue and should be for entitlement reform, be for what's necessary to fix the debt and our long-term situation, is because we want to keep those two great social programs that define the United States of America. We want to keep them solvent and up and running. And we better do something about it now, not at the last minute, which is our one. Thirdly, Judd and I have authored a piece that was in the Hill, an op-ed piece about the desperate need for tax reform. Progressives should care about tax reform because we have a tax system where Walgreens makes money. The bottom line of Walgreens, that they'll make money by offshoring their corporate headquarters. They will make significant dollars by doing that, taking jobs, creativity, and investment out of the United States and taking it to Ireland. That's what our tax code has wrought. It has enabled companies to take their profits, their revenue, their investment revenue, and their jobs offshore. We've got to change that. We desperately need the tax reform that will come with fixing the debt. The next reason is that what's going on now, all of this deficit reduction, not all of it, some of it has come from raising revenue, but a lot of it is, almost all of the rest of it has come from discretionary spending. And if you're a conservative, you'll say, well, discretionary spending ought to be cut. We ought not to have food stamps. We ought not to have LIHEAP and programs like that, or they shouldn't be so rich or robust or whatever. But we're also crowding out investment. Investments come from discretionary spending. The president is right when he says we need to invest in at least three things. We desperately need to invest in our infrastructure. The Highway Trust Fund is out of money come the end of July. We desperately need to invest. Our infrastructure is crumbling. It endangers our public safety, it ruins our quality of life, it makes us less competitive economically, and we're missing the opportunity to create millions of well-paying jobs by really fixing our infrastructure. There's no money for research and development. We cut our research and development funds. We cut our NIH funds. Those are funds that not only can do a world of good by discovering cures for diseases, but funds that produce incredible economic opportunities for this country as well. And lastly, and perhaps in the long run, most dangerous of all, we are not investing in the education and training of our workforce. That's a moral issue, but it's also an economic competitiveness issue. So not fixing the debt crowds out the investments we should be making. And we can do all of those things. We can fix the debt and do the things necessary to allow us to invest. Also, as the interest on our debt rises, and in less than 15 years, 75% of federal spending will be on mandated programs, mostly healthcare, Medicare, and Social Security, mandated programs, and the interest on the debt. By the end of this decade, the interest on the debt will be 17% of the federal budget. And when that occurs, interest on everything else goes up. So the middle class that depends on mortgage loans, on automobile loans, on college loans, they will be paying much more out of their pocket. It's a hidden tax increase. So it is time for us as progressives to realize that we have to fix the debt. And I'll let Judd talk about this, and we'll talk about it in the question and answer period. How do we do it? There are two, Willie Sutton had a answer to the question, why do you rob banks? He said, because that's where the money is. And if we seriously want to do something about our debt, we have to look at two things. We have to look at tax reform and entitlement reform, because that's where the money is. In 1980, the federal government lost in revenue $600 billion annually because of what we call tax expenditures. Those are tax loopholes, tax credits, whatever you want to say about them. $600 billion of revenue was not collected because Congress passed some form of tax expenditure. That total has ballooned to $1.3 trillion a year. $1.3 trillion a year. Remember I said we need to do $2.2 trillion of more deficit reduction in the next 10 years to get down to stabilize our debt at 70%. Well, if we took 1 out of every $4 of tax expenditures out of the budget, that's over $300 billion. We could do the 2.2 and still have $100 billion left to lower corporate tax rates. Something that we need to do. Something that would help us with the offshoring problem. There's no question that we have the ability to do it right there, but we don't need to do it all on that side because we need to do entitlement reform. We need to slow the expenditures in our entitlements. For example, we need to raise the age limit for Social Security and Medicare. Now, I know that's death for politicians to say, but it isn't really, because it's been done. How many times, Judd, has Congress raised the age limit on Social Security? At least 2 that I know of, right? They didn't die. They didn't all get defeated. Because senior citizens are not dumb. You talk to a bunch of senior citizens. I was up at Harvard. Harvard has this program where seniors actually pay money to go to school and they get some sort of Harvard diploma and they bring speakers up. And to a room full of senior citizens, I said, anybody know when Social Security was passed into law? 1935. Anybody know what the average lifespan was in 35? 64. Anybody know when Medicare was passed into law? 65. Anybody know how lifespan had grown? It was 67.8 at that point. Today, the lifespan, the average lifespan is 79.8 years, and if you live to be 65, it's 84 years. Those programs were never intended to cover 25, 30 years. It's common sense. Now, when you talk about raising the age limit of those programs, you will get howling, reflexive howling from progressives and people in my party. Nancy Pelosi said, never. She said, we're going to tell a chambermaid who spent 40 years making other people's beds and whose back is broken, we're going to tell her that she has to work 2 more years before she gets Social Security. Well, that's a good point, Nancy. It is a good point. You could do a carve-out for people at a certain income level and keep them at the current age limit, and for everybody else, raise the age limit. You could do a carve-out by jobs. I mean, there's a solution to every problem if we just act in good faith. So we've got to do something about entitlement reform. The president proposed, and now he's backed away, from chain CPI. When you've heard chain CPI, if you mention chain CPI, if I mention it on television, I am guaranteed to get 100 emails or responses on Twitter calling me a fascist, for sure. But chain CPI, every economist will tell you it's more realistic than the way we compute inflation for our programs, not just Social Security and Medicare, but for all of our programs. If we switch to chain CPI, which only slows the rate of growth in benefits, it doesn't reduce benefits, it slows the rate of growth. If we switch to chain CPI, in years 10 through 30, we would reap enormous benefits towards fixing the debt and creating long-term solvency. Now, let me close by saying, people on my side would say, you're right about Social Security and Medicare, we've got to create solvency, but we can do that. Let's means test Medicare, let's uncap taxation and payroll taxes for Social Security. That's the way to do it. Well, yeah, I agree with that. I agree with that. I think it's silly that I get what I'm finally earning as a private citizen, that I get $28,000 a year in Social Security. I shouldn't. I qualify for Medicare. Now, I'm working, so I don't take Medicare, but I could get Medicare payments. I should. So I think that that's probably in the Palace of Truth and Justice the right way to do it. But are Republicans going to fix Social Security and Medicare solely by increasing revenue, by increasing taxes? Of course not. It's not going to happen. I'd like to wake up tomorrow morning and comb my hair in a pompadour. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. And we've got to come to grips with that. And the other side has got to realize we're not going to get this problem under control, the problem that they talk about all the time, without raising some revenue. And we can raise revenue by getting rid of tax expenditures and tax loopholes that nobody wants. The Tea Party doesn't want. I think the Tea Party wants Exxon, that's made record corporate profits for the last 5 years, In the teeth of a recession, they made record corporate profits. Do you think they should get, and the other oil companies should get a subsidy that amounts to $4 billion a year? Of course not. Do you think any Tea Partyite's going to care about that? Do you think any Tea Partyite's going to care about enacting a solution that Governor Romney put on the table that we don't? That we cap charitable deductions at $50,000? How many Tea Partyites or how many people in this room give more than $50,000 to charity? Very, very few. And is it going to hurt charities? Naive. You think people give $10 million to an art museum to get a tax deduction? They do it to get their name right on the front of that art museum. Mitt Romney also suggested that we eliminate the mortgage interest deduction on second homes, or on homes worth more than $800,000. There are common sense ways to do this, and if I could do one thing in Washington, I would pipe in a song to the Capitol, and it would play everywhere. It would play in all the Capitol dining rooms, it would play in the bathrooms, it would play in the cloakrooms, and it would be a song by those great philosophers, the Rolling Stones. And the song would be, "You can't always get what you want." Because think about that. Remember what the second line was of that song? Anybody? But if you try sometimes, you'll get what you need. Both sides have to understand, we can't get everything we want. But if we try sometimes, we'll get exactly what we need. And there is a path to fix the debt, to get this country back on track, to get our economy soaring again, to make our entitlement program solid. We've just got to learn how to work together.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Neil Levesque, and I'm the Executive Director here at the New Hampshire Institute of Politics. Fred has asked me to introduce our next speaker, Senator Gregg, which is a little odd considering the fact that Senator Gregg is the founder of the New Hampshire Institute of Politics, together with his wife Kathy. They got together with Father Jonathan DeFelice, who we all know, and they had this idea about creating an institute where we could have some real civic engagement, real civic dialogue. And so it was his idea. He proposed we have a better air conditioner. We ignored him. Sorry about that. Senator Gregg served 3 terms in the U.S. Senate. During that time, as mentioned, he served as chairman of the Education Committee. But in relevance today, he was chairman of the Budget Committee. Before that, he served as governor of New Hampshire and is a member of the House. Obviously, he has extensive knowledge and a true passion for our fiscal health, and that is why he's agreed to co-chair Fix the Debt. Senator Gregg.
Technologically challenged, so we need a lot of help. It's a great pleasure to be here at the Institute, and thank you very much, Neil, for that kind introduction. It's great to be here with Tom and Fred and Renee. It's especially nice to be here with Governor Rendell, who I have tremendous admiration for and genuinely believe that even though he doesn't appreciate the fact that in Iowa they pick corn and in New Hampshire we pick presidents, that his picture should be on this wall here as a candidate for president and potentially as president, because he makes so much sense, and it's hard to follow him because his clarity is so good and so effective on the issue of our problems and how we resolve those problems. It's also nice to be here with these students because, honestly, the problem which we're talking about today is going to be passed on to you. It's going to affect your life significantly more than it will affect those of us who are a little elder in this audience. Because you're the ones who are going to have to pay for all this debt that we're adding up. And as Governor Rendell said, this is really not a problem that is abating. It is growing. You don't hear about it the way you did maybe 2 years ago because there was that intense confrontation between the Congress and the President, between the Senate and the House, over how to try to address the issue. And as Ed mentioned, most of the decisions which were made, and some of them were fairly significant, for example, the sequester language, were done on the discretionary side of the ledger. And obviously we went through a government shutdown, we went through the fiscal cliff confrontation, and it became the center of political discussion and focus for quite a while. That has sort of abated rather considerably, and as Ed said, it's because the deficits have been coming down, but it has not resolved the problem that it has abated. As my friends in the state senate here, and I see a few of them, know, fiscal problems just don't seem to go away when you're in government. You can claim they don't exist, but they do exist, and in fact, our problems not only exist, but are continuing to grow. I wanted to just go to a couple of slides to try to reinforce basically what Governor Rendell said, what Ed said, which was so effective. Hopefully this will work. Which one of these do I push? Oh, let me go back. This issue is not new, and it is really a function of a government that's not functioning appropriately in addressing it. And actually, it was Adam Smith, who was the creator of the concept of capitalism and markets, who said that great nations are not impoverished by their people. They're basically impoverished by their governments who don't act effectively. He used the word prodigality, which is an old English term for ineffective mismanagement. And that's the problem we have. We have a government that's not acting effectively. Actually, Milton Friedman, who I think was probably the finest economist in the post-World War II period, said it another way. He said, if you put the federal government in charge of the Sahara Desert, we'll have a shortage of sand in 5 years. But to try to put in context what our problem is and why it is so large, think about it as a percentage of GDP, which is what Ed referred to. The fact that our debt as a percentage of GDP has grown exponentially in the last few years and has put us in a position where we as a nation are essentially on a pathway to bankruptcy. And this chart, which shows the rate of growth of that debt, which is the deficits, is driving the debt. Deficits drive debt. And when you get a deficit, that immediately has to be paid for. How do you pay for it? You pay for it by borrowing money, which you don't have. The debt has doubled over the last few years, and it will triple by the time of 2021. And as a percentage of GDP, it has already gone to about 70% of GDP. It's headed to about 78% of GDP. And as Ed mentioned, it has historically been around, up until about 2008, only 35% of GDP. That's important. Let's see if I go back to this. Should be one more slide in here, but there isn't. Okay. That's important because if you put it in the context of other countries which have had a problem, there is sort of a break point. When your debt crosses 60% of GDP as a nation, you're in serious trouble. When your debt crosses 75% of GDP, you're in extraordinary trouble. When it crosses 100% of GDP, you're basically in a spiral which makes it very hard for your economy and for your nation to recover from it. And if you take the top 6 countries in this world today who have debt to GDP problems, the first would be Japan. Now, Japan has a unique situation. They have about a 200% debt to GDP problem. But because the Japanese people save so aggressively, they can essentially finance their debt internally by borrowing from their own people. Whereas we can't do that because we don't have that type of savings rate. We have to borrow from other countries. China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, other countries with some significant amount of extra wealth, they're willing to buy our debt. So Japan's in a little unique position. The second most country with the worst debt to GDP ratio is Greece. Greece has already gone through bankruptcy. The third country is Ireland. Ireland has already gone through bankruptcy. The fourth country is Italy. Nobody really knows where Italy's situation is because nobody knows how they keep their books. But as a very practical matter, they are bankrupt as a nation. The fifth country with a serious debt to GDP ratio is Belgium, which is really too small to worry about. I know there's nobody here from Belgium, so I'm not but it's really too small to worry about. The sixth country with the worst debt to GDP ratio is the United States. The reason we aren't bankrupt like Greece and Ireland, Italy, is because we have an extraordinarily vibrant economy, and we have a world that looks at us as being willing to solve problems. And so they're willing to give us much more running room than they give other countries. And therefore, even though our debt to GDP ratio is well over 60% now and headed towards 100%, we are being given running room. But how long we're given that running room is really only a function of how long the confidence in America's ability to address our problem exists in the marketplace and in the world marketplace. As Ed said, at some point you have a cataclysmic event where somebody wakes up somewhere and says they no longer have a confidence in America's ability to pay its debt back in real dollars. In other words, somebody comes to the conclusion that because our debt has gotten so high, the only way we can pay it back is to inflate our economy and reduce what we're basically paying our debt back with. And so at that point, when somebody wakes up in one of these nations, whether it be China or Russia, Saudi Arabia or someplace else, and the markets react rather instantaneously, as they tend to do when the herd moves against you, there's no stopping it, then you have a fiscal crisis. Because people no longer have confidence in your currency, and your cost of debt goes up exponentially, and you get into a spiral where your cost of debt becomes so excessive that you can't really finance it without inflating your currency, which is the worst type of taxation. What does this mean for Americans specifically, this rapid increase in debt? Well, this chart shows it. Today, a person under the age of 21, and I know we have some students here who are under the age of 21, in 2009, an individual under the age of 21 would have to pay back approximately $85,000 of their lifetime's earnings would have to go to pay the debt. By 2010, that was $114,000. By 2017, to pay back the federal debt, a person will have to earn approximately $200,000. Why is that number important? Well, it's important because $200,000 is the net worth of the average American family, not low-income family, but the average American family's net worth. So essentially, we have borrowed the entire net worth of most Americans, and we put that debt on them burden, and that puts them in a very difficult situation. What's driving this? Well, as Ed again mentioned, it's primarily entitlement spending. If you look at this chart, it reflects what three major programs are costing in unfunded liability: Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. The unfunded liability of those programs, that means after you collect all the Social Security taxes, after you collect all the hospital taxes, the unfunded liability of those programs is approximately $80 trillion. Trillion with a T. Now, I don't know what $1 trillion is, but you know, Fred probably does because he makes all this big money, but it's a lot of money. To try to put $1 trillion in context, if you take all the taxes raised in the United States, since we started collecting taxes in 1789 as a nation, after New Hampshire ratified the Constitution and made this country the country, we all know that, right? It wasn't New Hampshire that created the United States because we were the 9th state to ratify, even though Pennsylvania was the 2nd. Since that happened, if you take all the taxes raised, it's about $48 trillion. If you take the net worth of the United States, all our cars, our houses, our stocks, our bonds, it's about $55 trillion. So we actually have an obligation that is unfunded, that we have no idea how we're going to pay for in these three major entitlement programs that exceeds our net worth as a nation by about half. That is the definition of bankruptcy, and it needs to be addressed. This chart, regrettably, shows the problem in more stark terms because it shows what our historic collection of revenues have been, what our historic spending has been. Our historic spending has been about 20.4%. Our historic collection of revenues has been about 18.6%. And the red line shows spending, and the blue line shows revenues. And you can see where revenues and spending went in completely opposite directions as a result of the fiscal crisis of 2008. That dramatically exploded the debt and the deficit. That happens in recessions. This one was the worst since the Depression, so it was much more exaggerated, and the problem was more acute. But historically, those lines start to come back together as the economy starts to recover, as you can see is what's happening in 2011 and 2012. But now you see what is the most disturbing fact of this chart, which is the spending side of the equation is starting to go back up. What's driving that? It should be going down, because as an economy recovers, you should start to see convergence. But it's going back up. What's driving that? Primarily, it's demographics and healthcare costs. We have the largest generation in the history of this country, the baby boom generation, of which I and Ed are both members, and it's retired. We're going from 35 million retired people to 70 million retired people. We have a system where basically, as Ed outlined, we have a structured safety net for people who are retiring, which was designed years ago when we expected much lower life expectancies and where we had many fewer people paying into the system than, many fewer people taking out of the system than paying in. For example, in 1950, we had 16 people paying into Social Security for every one person taking out. Today, we have 2 people, 2.4 people, exact, whatever 0.4 person is. I don't see any 0.4 people in the audience today. But we have 2.4 people paying in the system for every one person taking out. So we've gone from a pyramid system where you had a huge number of people supporting the number of people taking benefits to basically a rectangle because of the size of the baby boom generation retirement. Simply doesn't work. And so we have to address these issues. And as Ed said, it has to be addressed in 3 different areas. On the entitlement side, it has to be addressed with Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, although Social Security, I believe, should be a sidetrack. And on the revenue side, it has to be addressed through tax reform. Regrettably, I think because of the lack of focus on this issue, which has occurred over the last 6 to 8, 12 months, we're seeing the will to step up and address the entitlement question or tax reform abating. And in fact, unfortunately, the recent VA bill which passed was an expression of truly going in the wrong direction. We all know the VA system is a disaster. It's inexcusable what was being done to people who had served our nation, who were being put into holding patterns which they weren't even being told about, or not being given the access to the health care which they should be getting. And correcting that had to happen. And it should happen. But in correcting it, we shouldn't be aggravating dramatically the debt situation for the next generation, which all our veterans fought so hard to make sure they'd have a decent life. And what happened in this veterans bill was that they doubled the commitment to veterans, which was totally appropriate and needed if we were going to get our veterans system straightened out, but they didn't pay for any of it. That's all going to be borrowed. They used something called the emergency designation to pass the bill, which meant that they could waive the obligation to pay for it. Now, the veteran situation was an emergency, but it wasn't an emergency that would fall under the emergency designation, which is designed for things like hurricanes and act of God. It was a predictable event, and it shouldn't have been waived. The pay-go language should not have been waived. And then they converted the new system that they created into an entitlement, so that it's on automatic pilot. And again, they didn't pay for any of this. This was voted for by 97 members of the Senate. Both sides of the aisle, unfortunately, stepped away from fiscal responsibility because they had a problem and passed the bill which addressed the problem, but passed the bill for the problem on the students who were going to have to pay for that debt. And so we're not really headed in the right direction right now. What do we need to do to correct this? What we need to is, as Ed mentioned, do 3 major things, which is address our Medicare, our Medicaid, and our revenue system. Why don't I have Social Security on there? You can put Social Security on there, and Ed's solution to Social Security were very appropriate. I served on the Simpson-Bowles Commission. We came up with a comprehensive proposal, which would have put this country back on a pathway to solvency. We decided as a commission, although we reduced the deficit by $4 trillion over 10 years, to take Social Security and do it as a sidecar because we didn't want to draw it into the debate. But we did fix it. We fixed it actuarially for 75 years by doing exactly what Ed suggested, which was raise the age of retirement, change the means testing, and adjust some of the other, and adjust the COLAs. So we need to reform Medicare, we need to reform Medicaid, and we need to reform our taxes. How do we reform Medicare? Well, essentially, you can really trace almost all the fiscal issues which we have today as a country to the healthcare problems and the cost of healthcare. driven again by the demographic shift and by the explosion in technology and healthcare, which is extraordinarily expensive. So we have, at the federal level, unfortunately, a healthcare system, even after the Obamacare or ACA bill, which you can debate, and I'm happy to debate. I think it was poorly directed. Others, I'm sure, thought it was a good idea. But we still have a system which is rewarding utilization instead of outcomes. And we have to switch to a system which basically looks at outcomes and rewards those folks who are getting quality outcomes at a lower cost. Interestingly enough, the Dartmouth-Hitchcock Hospital and the Dartmouth Institute have done most of the major studies which are effective in this area. And they are doing tremendous work nationally through a consortium of 17 major hospitals involving 70 million patients that involve things like the Mayo Clinic and Baylor and folks all over the country, in tying outcomes to value. For example, they've studied knee replacements, and they've concluded that across these very high-quality healthcare systems, that the variance in cost for a full knee replacement is between $2,000 and $20,000, but that the outcomes are essentially the same. And so what they're trying to do is create structures which encourage people to do it for $2,000 rather than do it for $20,000. This type of promotion is very important. We also have to move the generics, and we have to stop subsidizing, as Ed said, people of high incomes for insurance. Which, you know, why should Warren Buffett's Part B Medicare be subsidized? I mean, let's be honest about this. It's foolish. The second thing we have to do is tax reform. Now, in what we did, and this was alluded to by Ed, in Simpson Bowles once, we decided right up front, and this was done by Ernst & Bowles, that we were going to reduce the debt by $4 trillion over 10 years, because that was the number we needed then, to get the debt stabilized at 70% of GDP. We were going to do $3 trillion of that on the spending side and $1 trillion on the revenue side. But how do we get the revenues? We did it in a way that I strongly support. We cut rates dramatically and created what we thought would be significant economic activity. We took the expenditures, which were referred to again by Ed, which were about $1.2 trillion at that time, eliminated or sharply reduced most of those deductions and exemptions, so that we produced $1.1 trillion annually of new essential revenues, which were being expensed at the point. Took $1 trillion of reduced rates, so the top rate on the Simpson Bowles, the rates were 10, 15, and 23%. The top rate was 23%. And took $100 billion annually and put it towards debt reduction. So over 10 years, that was $1 trillion. So of the $4 trillion we got over 10 years, $100 trillion of it came through revenue by radically reducing rates. And this got the support of a very bipartisan group of folks. 3 of the most conservative members of the Senate who were serving on the commission, fiscally conservative, myself, Tom Coburn, and Mike Crapo, and some of the most progressive members of the Senate, Dick Durbin and Ken Conrad. That's the way you do this. You reduce the tax expenditures, you reduce the rates so you create more economic incentive by having people invest for the purposes of return rather than invest for the purposes of getting tax avoidance. You get much more efficient use of dollars, you generate more economic activity, and in the process, you also reduce the debt. So this is where we are today, and I'd like to conclude with this. I mean, this is very heavy stuff to have to eat breakfast over. If you look at around the rest of the world, every major industrial society, Europe, Russia, China, Brazil being the biggest, have huge structural problems. Problems which are probably not all that solvable. China, India. China has 1.3 billion people. That's a billion more people than we have. Billion more people than we have. They've had a one-child policy now for 40 years, which means they've got one child supporting 2 parents and 4 grandparents. They have a demographic tsunami coming at them that is going to have a disproportionate impact on their capacity. India has 1.2 billion people, 300 million of those people live in what we would call middle-class incomes. But 800 million people live on $1 a day. How do you run a country when you've got 800 million people living on $1? Very hard. Structurally very hard to get off of it. Russia has no rule of law, as we all know. Europe has a debt system which is so extraordinarily large that they cannot grow their way out of their debt problems. At some point, they're going to have to figure out how to handle the euro in a way that allows some of their southern economies to devalue their currency, or otherwise they simply can't get out from underneath their debt. We, on the other hand, are the light. We're the bright light in this. We've got these problems, but as Ed said, it's a $2.2 trillion problem based off a $40 trillion basis. That's 10-year. Those are 10-year numbers. That's less than 5%. This is a very solvable issue for us. All it takes is a little political courage to step up and take on the issues of entitlements and tax reform. And on top of that, as a nation, we're on the cusp of what I think is going to be one of the great growth periods economically in the history of our country. We are seeing the most important paradigm shift in our economy since the 1950s, because for the first time since the 50s, we're going to be a country which actually can export energy rather than have to import energy. And energy runs through the entire economy. It's not just putting gas in your car, everything is energy impacted. Plus, we're still the country where all the great ideas come from, whether they're Twitter or Facebook or whatever, or Tesla. We still have massive amounts of capital available that wants to invest in entrepreneurs, and we still have an extraordinarily entrepreneurial culture. So we're on the cusp of a huge, I think, economic explosion. The only thing that's retarding us is our willingness to step up and take on these programs, as Ed pointed out, in a rational way and in a bipartisan way. Medicare, Medicaid, and tax reform. We can solve this as a country. If we do, our future is extraordinarily bright. Thank you very much.
All right. I'll sit there in my lap. You know, it occurs to me, I was on Warren Ruckman's Senate staff, and there was something called Graham Ruckman Allen's Deficit Reduction Law, Senator, which you remember, and governor. And the law basically said if you, Senator, were to go to the Senate floor and propose new spending, you had to also propose where you're going to fund that money. For a couple of years in the late 80s, it worked. And the deficit started to level off and looked like it would start to go down, and then it was scrapped. And I just wonder out loud, Senator Gregg, if that had stayed on the books, would it have made a difference?
No. Unfortunately, you can't fix this procedurally. Essentially, Graham Ruckman Hollings was replaced by Pago. But while I was in the Senate, Pago was almost, it was constantly waiting. If members decided they wanted to spend more money, as they did in this VA bill, they would wait Pago and figure out a way around it. You really can't do this procedurally. What you have to do is essentially what Simpson Bowles did. You have to put a group of conscientious people in a room who are totally bipartisan and who represent the fairly aggressive wings of their party for fiscal policy. Have them work through a process, much as occurred in the Social Security Bill in 1983, when you had Tip O'Neill and President Reagan reach an agreement, or the Tax Reform Bill in 1986, when you had Dan Rostenkowski and President Reagan reach an agreement. Work through a process where both sides give, but do not give up their basic beliefs, and reach a consensus. And the number is not that big that it's very doable with very reasonable policy. But at the bottom line, it takes leadership. We need some guy like Ed Rendell to step into that room and tell everybody what to do to get it done.
Well, let me just add two things. I think Judd's exactly right. And what it takes is presidential leadership. And I am not a critic of the president. I think he's got the right values and he's tried hard and he's had some successes. But he commissioned Simpson Bowles. And then he didn't reject Simpson Bowles, but he didn't act upon it. And he said the reason he didn't act upon it because there were no votes in the Congress. Well, if you're the executive, and both Judd and I have been executives, Judd was a legislator, I never was, but your job is to go convince the legislature to do something. That's in the job description. That's almost task one for a mayor, a governor, or a president. And I believe if the president tried on Simpson Bowles, he might have found a lot of support on both sides of the aisle, actually, on both sides of the aisle. So I'd like to hear what Judd thinks about that. I also want to say that what Judd's proposing can be done. Base closure. We can never close bases and save money in the military because the Congress could never do it because there would be a fight. My base in California is not going to close your base in Portsmouth, you know, etc. So finally they developed a process where there was a base closure commission with people appointed to it. They came up with reasonable suggestions. And all the Congress could do was vote it up or down in its entirety. They couldn't change it. And by and large, base closure has worked to reduce the unwanted parts of the military budget. But do you think there were votes for Simpson Bowles if the president had invested political capital in it?
Yes, and the original Simpson Bowles was a bill called Conrad Gregg. Gregg Conrad in New Hampshire. Which took the base closure language and put it on the whole budget. And required an up or down vote on an agreement, which would have been the Simpson Bowles agreement. But Simpson Bowles was a commission that didn't have the force of law to force the vote. There was some tacit understanding that if it got 14 members to vote for it, the majority leader would have brought it to the floor of the Senate. He didn't need 14 votes. There were 11 votes for it, including 5 of the 6 senators. So he certainly could have brought it to the floor of the Senate. I think if it had been brought to the floor of the Senate and the president had been for it, and the Speaker of the House had been for it, the political capital, they risked their political capital on it, stepped on a few toes on both sides of their on both sides of the aisle on their constituencies, we couldn't pass it.
You know, when you pay for something like we do for the federal government or for GM cars, you expect them to work. Why don't things work on the Hill? And I'm asking both of you, because as we sit out here, we get frustrated, and I'm sure you are too. Because Simpson Bowles didn't make it to Congress, and you just explained that. There have been other proposals. Is there anything taking place now, even quietly behind the scenes, that would begin to seriously, on a bipartisan basis, address deficit and debt?
Well, you got Bob Bixby here. The Reform Coalition has been extraordinarily constructive in this area, and the Fix the Debt group, we've tried, and myself also, headed up by Mine McGinnis, but there was, up until about 6 months ago, a very strong functioning group within the Senate, which was extraordinarily bipartisan, which involved somewhere between 20 and 40 senators who were moving towards a solution. But the air went out of that balloon for a lot of different reasons. How you get that balloon, the air back in the balloon, regrettably we function in crisis as a nation, which is a problem. Hopefully we won't have to wait for a crisis. Hopefully we'll just get some presidential leadership. I mean, I think presidential leadership is the key here. There is, however, two, I think, very significant structural problems confronting getting anything done in Washington today, whether it's immigration reform, tax reform, Medicare, Medicaid reform. The first is that the House of Representatives has become dominated by 60 to 65% of the seats are now gerrymandered by parties, which means that people who are, neither of our seats here, as Dick Sweat certainly knows, and I know, having represented the 2nd District, have that problem. But these seats, to get elected, all you have to do is win your primary. But to win a primary, you've got to speak to your most fervent part of your party. So if it's a liberal district, you get your liberal party, your liberal members voting, and if it's a conservative district, you have conservative members voting. And the one thing the base on both sides won't tolerate is compromise. And you can't govern unless you are willing to go across the aisle. You just can't govern in our system. Our system is not parliamentary. It is built on checks and balances and requires people going across the aisle. But the House of Representatives is now structured so 60–65% of the people, if they want to get reelected, by definition can't cross the aisle because they'll be challenged from their right or the left, depending on their district. And they probably won't be reelected in their primary. So the House is shut down. So the only way you can do this is by a consensus bill coming out of the Senate, supported by the President, taken to the House that the majority, the Speaker supports and gets the votes from both sides of the aisle. The second big problem, I think, is the rise of the blogosphere. It's a great benefit to this world that people can communicate so effectively today. But it does have its downside, and the biggest downside is exactly what Ed was talking about. It's the virulent anger of the majority of the discussion that occurs in the blogosphere. And basically it drowns out the capability to have comprehensive and thoughtful discussion about complex problems, because everybody just shouts. And this is aggravated by 24/7 newscasting, which is basically directed at getting a specific audience, and thus you get a lot of shouting in the newscasting. But it's really, it's very hard to have thoughtful and comprehensive and discussion on complex bills and issues because people go immediately to slogans and they shut you down on the blogosphere.
Yeah, I think Judge Wright, procedurally you can change it. I mean, there are states that have done independent citizen commissions on redistricting. Good idea. What California is experimenting with, we all should take a hard look at, and that is everyone runs in the primary, Democrats and Republicans alike. They're allowed to have their party identification, and then the voters vote, and the two highest vote getters in the primary run in the general. So you could have two Democrats running against each other in the general, or two Republicans. And that forces the Republicans to go to the middle and the Democrats to go to the middle, because they want to get those votes. So it's a very interesting ways to go about it. But in the end, it takes political courage. It takes people to get up there and say to themselves, I came here for a reason. I just didn't come here to put my rear end in a chair and collect a salary and have people call me senator or congressman or whatever. I came here to do something. And if you came here to do something, there's got to be, I wrote a book, and my favorite chapter, I got the title of all my chapters, is Stand and Defend, There Are Some Things Worth Losing For. And there are some things worth losing for. And our politicians they've lost respect for our intelligence. And it's a two-way street. They don't respect our intelligence because we don't vote a lot. There was a great former governor and congressman in Delaware by the name of Mike Castle. Served with Judd, served with you, Congressman. Great guy. He ran in the Republican primary for senator against a woman by the name of Christine O'Donnell, who you'll best remember because she practiced witchcraft and then had to deny in a commercial that she was a witch. She had a commercial in which she said, I am not a witch. She beat Mike Castle, the most respected political leader, in a primary, but only 17% of registered Republicans turned out to vote in the primary. So I just say to my friends in Delaware, don't complain, you didn't vote. You let the extreme base vote, and you didn't vote. And until we started voting, look at Kellyanne, and I don't mean to have other people from our staff, a Republican who I had a great deal of admiration for. She took a dive on universal background checks, even though polls showed that almost 9 out of 10 New Hampshireites were in favor of it. Why? Because of the blogosphere, because there are all of them, I'm not picking on her, I'm just here in New Hampshire, but all of our politicians, they respond to phone calls, emails, tweets, and they don't realize that doesn't represent us at large. And the NRA can target and marshal a small amount of single-issue voters. But what the heck? I mean, there were 4 Democrats who voted against universal background checks when the polls in their states were the same. Why? 90% of your constituents wanted it. It was the right thing to do. Anybody knows that it's obvious and he knows in your face. Why don't you respect us and believe that we can do something? Well, maybe because we don't earn their respect by voting. If people turned out in primaries, we wouldn't have this problem. I say to poor Democrats in Philadelphia who complain about what's going on in Washington or what's going on in Harrisburg, I said, you voted for president, didn't you? Yes. Did you vote for governor? Did you vote for senator? No. The drop-off in Pennsylvania between the presidential election year and the governor-senator election year is 1 million voters. 1 million less voters in Pennsylvania cast ballots in non-presidential year. So it goes both ways. We're at fault, the public, and our representatives are at fault because they need to take a shot of courage and do the right thing. I mean, gosh, why are we here? There. Russ Feingold walked out of the Senate with his head held high. He always did what he believed, and he voted against the Patriot Act. He was the only guy who voted against the Patriot Act. And when he lost in 2010, he walked out with his head held high. And how does his vote against the Patriot Act look today?
We have people that might
also have
go ahead.
to think about it because I think it's more systemic than this. It's the fact that both parties are now moving into a structure that is based on factions. And you cannot govern in our system unless you push towards agreement. And the two-party system is the first step towards pushing towards agreement. It's where people of different views, but basically overarching philosophies come together and start to work towards an agreement within the party. And then from that, you get the two parties coming together in the legislative process to work towards an agreement. But today, the parties are factionalized at a level where within the parties themselves, people aren't communicating at all. And you've got it on the left, and you've got it on the right, and it's really debilitating to getting in government.
We've got some microphones that'll roam around, and let's go to your questions, George.
So, as I understand the argument, that if we reduce Medicare, Medicaid, and close the loopholes, that'll go a long way in solving our deficit problem. I'd like to also throw into the mix, what about defense spending? We financed 2 wars off budget. Senator, I think you were on the budget committee as we were financing those wars. So when we talk about political courage, do we listen to those voices that are saying, let's go to Syria, let's go to Ukraine, let's go into, have confrontation with Iran? I mean, don't we need to look at defense spending and put that into the mix as well?
Well, look, let me, Judge should give a longer answer to that, but let me just say 2 things. Number one, those issues are not mutually exclusive. You can still do certain things to protect American security and cut the defense budget, because there's waste in the defense budget, there are unnecessary weapons programs, the weapons programs have long since outlived their usefulness, they're being propped up because they create jobs in some of these districts. And to some extent, there has been cuts in the defense budget out of this process. Of the cuts that have been made, decent amount have come on the defense side. So I think we've got to continue that process. We've got to get across the idea to the American people that it's okay to spend money, even on defense. It's okay to spend money on infrastructure as long as we spend it wisely and efficiently. Spending is not the problem, it's how we spend.
Yeah, first off, we don't have to cut Medicare in the sense of reducing benefits. What we have to do is deliver benefits more intelligently by having an outcomes-based healthcare system rather than a utilization-based healthcare system. And it'll take a while, and quite honestly, it can't come from the top down, it has to come from the bottom up, it has to come through the hospital systems, seeing that there is a better way to deliver systems, deliver care. And that's in the process of evolving. Medicaid's a little different. The ACA expanded Medicaid coverage radically. And it is going to put all states, and New Hampshire's obviously dealing with that right now, in a very serious financial situation. The federal government's going to back out, and it's going to leave the states with a bill. And Lamar Alexander, former governor and senator, you know as well, used to say, and he used to say it tongue-in-cheek, but I think he actually meant it, because he used to be education secretary, I'll make a straight-up trade with you. Let the federal government take over all the Medicaid costs, and we'll take over all the education costs. Just trade education. States do all education, federal government does all Medicaid. That might actually be a pretty good way to solve this. But in any event, Medicaid should be handled by the states if it's going to be paid for by the states. And it should not be straitjacketed by federal oversight that causes the states to incur costs which they could probably significantly reduce if they were managing the program without the interference of Washington. Secondly, on the issue of defense spending, defense has to be looked at, and aggressively. But it has been. Probably more cuts have occurred in defense than any other function of the federal government under the sequester and under the August 2011 agreement, both of which totaled about $2.1 trillion in spending cuts. Those were all discretionary cuts. Half of discretionary spending is defense. So defense has already taken a significant hit. It needs to be restructured. The Defense Department needs to be restructured. Actually, when Chuck Hagel was nominated, he made the point. He put forward a very interesting restructuring concept, which was basically we go to the capacity of delivering lethal force effectively after having massive intelligence capability, rather than boots on the ground philosophy. But no question defense has to be looked at, but it's not where the big dollars are any longer. The big dollars are on the entitlement side of it.
Someone else? Yes, ma'am. Microphone? Yeah, here it comes.
Hi, I'm Lisa Whittemore. I'm a Democrat from Londonderry, New Hampshire. But I'd like to speak now on behalf of my many friends in the Republican Party. I've been in politics since the 1970s. I was 3 or 4 years old at the time. But at the time, I actually worked with as many Republicans, if not more Republicans, on a nonpartisan basis that I worked with Democrats. Sadly, over the years, I've seen the New Hampshire style of politics, which is that we talk across the aisle, which is that when we have an issue in common, we're all talking to each other, trying to reach that agreement. I've seen that winnowed away to this new system where even one moderate vote can garner a primary for a state senator particularly, or even House of Reps in New Hampshire, and have them primary, have them attack, have out-of-state money come in and target those seats. And they have been, unfortunately, very successful. So while I want to win my re-election, if there are any Londonderry voters here, Sharon Carson's my senator. But I don't want to see these moderate senators and these reasonable, common sense problem solvers taken out of our political system by out-of-state money. So Governor Rendell, you were talking about courage. Can you relate how a moderate in either party can function under the present system?
I'm a great believer that you can win. Look, Lindsey Graham was as close to a moderate Republican on immigration as there was in the Senate. And he made no bones about it. He explained what he did to his constituency, and he made no bones about it, and he got 57% of the vote in a 5-person field avoided a runoff. I think if I really wanted to be president, I'd be a moderate Republican and get in the primaries, hopefully against a field of people who are appealing to the base, because I think there are enough moderate voters in every state that person would get 30, 35, 37% of the vote and would go into the stretch run in a strong position. I think there's still moderate Republicans out there. I still think there are moderate Democrats out there. I believe that. And I believe the American people, we're getting a warped view of our electorate by what Judd said, by these primaries. I believe there are people out there, and you just got to talk to them. Joe Scarborough, good morning, Joe, and I'm on that show a lot. Joe Scarborough says, and it's true, I checked it one day. Joe represented a very old district in Florida, the Panhandle district, very old. It had military bases, but it had a lot of retired people. He told them the truth about Social Security. First time he ran in 92, I think he ran in 94. Now I thought he got in, he was part of the Gingrich Contract for America in 94. And he kept getting reelected in a district that had a predominant number of old voters. If you tell people the truth, and you tell it in a reasonable fashion, you just might find that they agree with you. I think part of it is that we politicians lack courage now. I think courage gets rewarded. I think Lindsey Graham got rewarded for telling the truth and not trying to bounce all over on his positions.
Oh yeah, you're both governors, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania. With the prospect that the Congress at some point will start cutting the deficit, cutting the debt. That's going to mean less money for the states. If you were governor now, each of your states, how would you be preparing for that day? I mean, what would be your priorities in terms of protecting programs that might be damaged by less federal money?
Well, getting into state politics as a federal legislator was something I always used to find inappropriate. When I was governor, I explained to a number of our congressmen in New Hampshire and our senators that they have no business in the state. And I think they listened after I told them to go as part of them as I could. You know, every state is going to have to deal with this in its own unique way. That's the genius of the American system, which is that we do have states. And our states are political entities of considerable impact and importance. Federal government has grown exponentially, but it's still the state which is incubating most of the good ideas. And so states have to be creative and they have to be realistic. The federal government, in its process of getting its deficit and its house in order, will obviously be changing its relationship with the states relative to support. And the states are going to have to anticipate that. Medicaid is going to be the biggest problem. Followed up, way back down the road is upon by the highway trust. But I don't. Every state's going to have to approach it in their own unique way. I have views, but it's not. I'm not running for office on my president. Telling city legislators how to run things.
Well, I mean, Judd is absolutely right. States have always been the laboratory of programs and new concepts. But the states have to come to grips with the fact that things are changing. And infrastructure and the highway program is a perfect example. Last year, 6 states, 3 red, 3 blue, last year passed significant increases in their transportation taxes. They're either gas tax or in Virginia, Governor McConnell's, with the Virginia legislature switched to the sales tax, but it increased revenue, no question about it. Wyoming, Republican House, Republican Senate, Republican governor increased their gas tax by 15 cents. Pennsylvania, Republican governor, I helped him get votes for a gas tax increase. It's a liquid fuels tax, which of course gets passed down at home, but he says it's not a tax on consumers, but it really is. But I helped him get votes for it. Over the course of the next 5 years, it will ramp up our gas tax by 26 cents a gallon. But the good news is, it produces $1.5 billion additional money above what we're spending for roads, highways, and bridges, and $500 million additional dollars annually for mass transit in the state. And that's a huge, it changes Pennsylvania's economy, it changes so many things about what we need to do in Pennsylvania. So if red states and blue states can do it, they've got to continue to do it. They've got to take care of business first, but they've got to send a message to the federal government. We're not absolving you from responsibility for helping us. We're willing to take our share of the burden. So when you look at federal legislators, I testified before the House Transportation Committee, 70 members on that committee, about the need for gas tax increase. And myself, the head of the chamber, and the head of the AFL-CIO, we were all for gas tax increase. Every one of the 70 members got up and said, I'm a Tea Party Republican, but I think we need to spend money on infrastructure. Everyone knows we have to spend money on our infrastructure, but nobody's willing to find a way to pay for it. Well, if the states can do it, if Wyoming can do it, if Virginia can do it, if Pennsylvania, which is totally red now, can do it, then we can do it in Congress as well. So I think there's got to be joint sharing of risk.
But I think, if I can just, I'm sorry to say this, but I go back to our basic problem, which is that we have a debt situation which, if we allow it to continue to grow, is going to put our children in a situation that this country has never done to another generation. We're going to end up passing on to the next generation a lower standard of living with less security because of our debt. But it's a totally solvable issue. As Ed has said, we're only dealing with $2-3 trillion, which is an only number in the context of the $40 trillion, $45 trillion base. And it can be resolved, and only be resolved if it is done in a balanced way. Simpson goals to $3 of spending, $1 of revenue, and it can only be resolved if it's done in a bipartisan way. And that means you have to have people who are willing to govern going to Washington. You can't have people who are going to stand in the corners and shout.
And with that, let's thank both our terrific speakers. Now we all return to our seats. I would like to introduce the Chancellor of the University System of New Hampshire, Todd Leach, who's going to make some final comments. Todd.
We heard this morning pretty clearly that debt is not a partisan issue, it's an issue for all of us. And it's an issue that requires bringing people together across party lines, something that Senator Judd Gregg and former Governor Rendell have done, and something we need more of in government in general. It's the approach we took when the university system was seeking to freeze tuition and working with legislators on both sides of the aisle, and it was an effective way for us to actually get something done. And it's the only way we're going to get big problems like national debt and issues addressed. As an educator, it's hard for me to talk about debt without also thinking about student debt. And I think there's some lessons here for us around the larger debt. New Hampshire is actually pretty unique in the not so good way, in that we have one of the largest student debt issues in the country. And not something for us to particularly be proud of, and something that's not surprising given the amount of support for the public system. But at the same time, there's a side of that story we don't hear about. We hear in the news quite a bit about how large the student debt is. But the part we don't normally hear about is that New Hampshire also has one of the lowest default rates in the country. So how is it we have students have such high debt and have such low default rates? The reason is because they're getting jobs and they're paying back their debt. And I think one of the things that's important here for us to keep in mind is that it's about the debt, but it's also about the return on investment. And in the case of our students, they're a really good return on investment. And I was very pleased to hear education highlighted as one of those areas where we really can't afford not to be investing. I think as we go forward today, just a couple of messages that I think should stick with us, and that is working across party lines, looking at coalitions, that we've got to work together to solve issues, that if we look at where we've had success in government in addressing issues, student debt, and the larger national debt are going to be no different, and going to get addressed as we work together to do that. And the final takeaway for me, at least, was to go back and listen to my Rolling Stones and think about what we can get done. So I want to thank both the Senator and the Governor. Thank you very much.